When I first moved in, I thought she was just my landlady, but the night she told me, "Don't knock next time, just come in," everything between us quietly changed. I still remember the first time I knocked on her door. My suitcase rested by my side, the hallway quiet except for the faint hum of the building's old heater. The corridor smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender, a detail I would come to associate with her over time. My hand hesitated for a moment before I rapped lightly on the door. It was the first day in my new flat, and behind that door was the woman who owned the place. The sound of soft footsteps approached, steady and unhurried. When the door opened, I caught my first glimpse of her, my landlady. She was older than me, of course, yet there was something graceful in the way she carried herself. Her dark hair framed her face in loose waves, a touch of silver catching the light from the hallway lamp. Her eyes, deep brown with a warmth that felt disarming, met mine with a polite but curious smile. "Ah, you must be the new tenant," she said, her voice even and low, touched with the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of experience. She opened the door wider, leaning lightly against the frame. There was no rush in her manner, no clipped formalities. Instead, she studied me for a moment, as though she wanted to be sure I felt welcome. "Yes," I replied, suddenly aware of how young I must have looked standing there, luggage in hand. "I'm moving in today. Thank you for having me." The corner of her lips curved into a softer smile. She gestured with one hand, the motion unhurried and graceful. "Come in, let me show you around." As I stepped inside, the warmth of her apartment contrasted with the cool hallway air. It smelled faintly of coffee and fresh linen, comforting in a way that made me feel less like a stranger. She pointed out where the keys hung on a small wooden rack, explained the quirks of the heating system, and reminded me about the recycling bins out back. Her words were practical, yet the way she spoke carried a quiet steadiness that felt grounding. When she handed me a spare key, her fingers brushed mine. It lasted only a second, yet I noticed the warmth of her skin, warm against my colder hands. She didn't pull away abruptly, just let the key rest against my palm with a trust that surprised me. Standing there, listening to her calm instructions, I realized something simple yet striking: she wasn't just a landlord performing a duty. There was a gentleness about her presence, an ease that made me want to linger in the doorway a little longer than necessary. That first knock, simple as it seemed, marked the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, but I knew it was more than just a tenant meeting his landlady. The days that followed passed quietly, but in ways that made her presence impossible to ignore. The building wasn't large, just a handful of apartments stacked over one another, so it was natural that we crossed paths often. Still, each small encounter carried more weight than it should have, as if there was something unspoken lingering in the air between us. Every morning, I'd hear the faint creak of her door before I even stepped into the hallway. She would be leaving for work, her heels clicking softly against the old wooden floorboards. I'd murmur a greeting, and she'd respond with that calm, steady smile of hers. Sometimes she carried a folder of papers tucked under her arm, other times, a small thermos of coffee that filled the hallway with a warm, bitter scent. Our conversations were brief: weather, the traffic, whether the old boiler was keeping the place warm enough. Yet I noticed the way her eyes met mine each time, not hurried, not dismissive. She had a way of holding a glance just long enough for it to feel intentional, and in those few seconds, I found myself more awake than any cup of coffee could make me. One afternoon, I stopped by her door to ask about the mail system. She opened it quickly, as if she had been expecting someone. The scent of lavender drifted out again, soft and familiar now. "It's all delivered to the main box downstairs," she explained, her hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The simple gesture seemed almost too graceful for such a practical exchange. Later that same week, she offered me a spare key in case the lock on my unit stuck, something she admitted happened from time to time. As she placed it in my palm, her fingertips grazed my skin. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent a quiet warmth through me, spreading far beyond where her skin had met mine. She didn't appear to notice, or maybe she simply chose not to mention it. Her expression remained calm, yet there was the faintest upward tilt at the corner of her lips, as though she knew more than she let on. At night, I'd sometimes hear her laugh echo faintly through the thin walls. It wasn't loud, but gentle and melodic, the kind of sound that carried warmth into otherwise empty spaces. Lying in bed, I caught myself smiling at the thought of her, imagining the light in her eyes when she laughed. These moments were small, ordinary even. Yet beneath them, something steady was growing, an unspoken familiarity, as if our lives were quietly stitching themselves together in the shared rhythm of the building. It was a Thursday evening when I found myself standing outside her door again. The hallway light flickered above me, buzzing faintly, casting shadows that swayed across the walls. I hadn't meant to bother her, but the bulb in my flat had gone out, and I didn't yet know where to find replacements. So, once again, I knocked. The sound of her footsteps reached me, softer this time, almost unhurried. When the door opened, she stood there in the warm glow of her living room lamp. She wasn't dressed for work like usual, no neat blouse or pencil skirt. Instead, she wore a loose cardigan over a simple top, her hair falling freely past her shoulders. Somehow, the more casual look made her presence even more disarming. "You again," she said, a playful curve in her voice. "Something broken already?" I rubbed the back of my neck, suddenly feeling younger than I wanted to. "Just a light bulb. Sorry to disturb you." Her eyes softened as she leaned lightly against the doorframe, her arms folding in a gesture both casual and protective. She studied me for a moment, then let out a small sigh, the kind that wasn't annoyance but rather a quiet acceptance. "You don't have to be so formal with me," she said finally, tilting her head slightly. "Next time, don't knock. Just come in." The words caught me off guard. They were simple, practical even, yet something in the way she said them carried a deeper note. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held me in place, as though she was letting me in on something more than just her apartment. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. "All right," I managed, though my heart beat harder than the moment warranted. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come on, I'll find you a bulb." I followed her inside. The room was softly lit, shadows dancing across shelves filled with books and framed photographs. It was a lived-in space, warm and textured, carrying the faint aroma of coffee and something floral. She moved gracefully through the room, pulling open a drawer until she produced a fresh bulb. As she handed it to me, our fingers brushed again. This time, she didn't look away. Her eyes lingered on mine, steady and unreadable, until I had to glance down, pretending to study the object in my hand. It was such a small exchange, ordinary on the surface. But as I left her apartment with the new light bulb, her words repeated in my mind like a quiet echo, "Don't knock next time, just come in." The first time I actually stepped into her apartment felt different than I expected. It wasn't a polite glimpse of a hallway or the few steps I'd taken before. This time, she welcomed me past the threshold, and I found myself surrounded by a world that seemed entirely her own. Her living room was warm and quietly inviting. The soft lamplight glowed against bookshelves that stretched across the far wall, their rows filled with novels whose spines showed the wear of years. Framed photographs dotted the space, some of landscapes, others of moments caught in time, though I didn't look too closely, not wanting to intrude on the details of her life. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something floral, like jasmine, mingling into a scent that felt instantly comforting. "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward a couch with a casualness that somehow made me more aware of my every move. I lowered myself onto the cushion, feeling the softness sink beneath me, while she moved to the small kitchen area. Her cardigan slipped slightly off her shoulder as she reached for a kettle, revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone before she pulled it back into place. The motion was simple, unthinking, yet it lingered in my mind. She returned with 2 mugs of tea, steam curling upward in lazy spirals. As she placed one in front of me, her fingers brushed mine for just a moment, and I felt the warmth of both the mug and her touch at once. "Careful," she said softly, almost a whisper. "It's hot." We sat together, the quiet stretching comfortably between us. The tick of a wall clock filled the silence, steady and grounding. At first, our conversation stayed safe, about the building, about the weather, about the city and its noise. But slowly, as though she'd decided I had earned a glimpse beyond the surface, she let her words drift deeper. She told me about her long workdays, about the little rituals she kept to unwind at night. In turn, I found myself speaking more honestly than I expected, about my own uncertainties, about how moving here felt like both an escape and a beginning. There was no rush in her responses. She listened in a way that made me feel as if my words mattered, her eyes steady, her posture leaning just slightly toward me. When she lifted her mug to her lips, I caught myself watching the gentle press of the porcelain against her mouth, the way her breath fogged briefly in the steam before she took a sip. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just inside her apartment. I was, in some quiet, fragile way, being let inside her life. The warmth of her apartment wrapped around me, yet a different kind of heat stirred inside, a quiet tension I couldn't quite name. We had been talking for a while, mugs now half empty on the low wooden table between us. The conversation had drifted from small, ordinary details into more personal ground, and it felt as though we were teetering on the edge of something unspoken. At one point, her laughter faded, and silence slipped between us. Not the uncomfortable kind, but a pause heavy with possibility. I found myself studying her, the way the lamplight softened her features, tracing the curve of her cheek and the gentle line of her jaw. She had tucked one leg beneath her, sitting in a posture that was both relaxed and quietly guarded, as though she wasn't entirely sure how much of herself she wanted to reveal. I wanted to move closer, to bridge the space between us, but hesitation held me in place. Questions crowded my mind. Was I imagining the way her gaze lingered on me a little too long? Did she notice how intently I was listening to every word she spoke, how the smallest gesture of hers seemed to anchor me? She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembling just slightly, though her expression remained composed. It was a small gesture, yet it betrayed something beneath the surface. For the first time, I saw her not only as composed and confident but also quietly vulnerable. My knee shifted unconsciously, and it brushed against hers beneath the table. The contact was fleeting, barely there, but I felt it like a spark. I froze, waiting for her to pull back. She didn't. Instead, her breath caught for the briefest moment, her lips parting as though she might speak, then closing again. She left her knee where it was, resting lightly against mine, as though the choice to stay silent carried more meaning than any words could. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. My chest tightened with the weight of the moment, torn between wanting to reach for her and fearing what it might mean if I did. She looked down at her mug, swirling the tea absently, her fingers tracing the rim. I realized then that we were both caught in the same hesitation, drawn together by something we hadn't named, yet unsure whether we had permission to cross the invisible line between us. The air felt charged, delicate, as though even the smallest movement could shift everything. And so, we sat there, caught in a silence that said more than words ever could. The silence between us had grown so full it felt like its own presence in the room. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the muted rush of a passing car, but inside her apartment the world felt suspended, caught between what was and what might be. My knee still brushed lightly against hers beneath the table, neither of us moving away. I drew a breath, the words weighing heavy on my tongue before I dared let them go. You know, I began softly, my voice barely above a whisper, being here, it feels different. Calmer. Like I can breathe in a way I don't anywhere else. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine. There was no playful smile this time, no mask of casualness. Just openness, hesitant, but real. She tilted her head slightly, as though listening not just to my words, but to the space between them. Her hand shifted on the table, fingertips tracing absent circles against the wood. Then, slowly, almost cautiously, she reached across the narrow distance and rested her fingers on the back of my hand. The touch was feather-light, trembling, as though she was testing how much of herself she dared reveal. I didn't expect this, she admitted, her voice carrying both strength and fragility. I've spent years keeping everything steady, controlled. I wasn't looking for anything more. She paused, her thumb brushing gently against my skin. But then you showed up, and suddenly, I can't ignore what I feel. Her words landed in me like warmth spreading through cold air. I turned my hand over, letting her fingers slip into mine, holding them carefully as though they were something fragile and precious. The simple contact sent a wave of steadiness through me, even as my heart raced. I feel it too, I confessed. I didn't know how to say it, but being around you, it means more than I can explain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, our hands entwined, the faint tick of the clock marking the seconds we let stretch endlessly. Her eyes softened, shimmering faintly in the lamplight, and for the first time, she didn't look away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden declaration or rush of passion. It was gentle, quiet, but in its quietness it carried all the weight of something undeniable. Two people, different in age and place, but meeting in the same fragile honesty. Her fingers tightened just slightly around mine, and that single, trembling motion said more than either of us could put into words. Her hand stayed in mine, warm and steady, and for a long moment we simply sat there, two people breathing in the same silence, both aware that something had shifted. The lamplight cast a golden glow across her living room, softening the edges of the shelves, the framed photos, and the quiet shadows around us. When she finally moved, it was not with hesitation but with a calm certainty. She leaned closer, her hair brushing lightly against my shoulder as she pressed her lips to my cheek. The kiss was not hurried. It lingered, gentle, warm, and full of meaning that words could never quite capture. My chest tightened, not with nerves, but with the startling realization of how much I wanted this closeness, how right it felt. As she pulled back, I caught the faintest smile on her lips, a mixture of relief and vulnerability. I wasn't sure if I should, she murmured, her voice low, her breath brushing across my skin. You don't have to explain, I said softly. My words were quiet, but every syllable carried the truth I felt. I understand. We shifted on the couch, and without needing to ask, she let her head rest against my shoulder. The weight of her presence was grounding, her hair soft against my jaw. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, unhurried now, each rise and fall syncing with the beat of my own chest. Outside, the distant city carried on, but inside, time seemed to fold in on itself, leaving only the two of us in that fragile stillness. I lifted my arm, letting it rest gently around her shoulders. She didn't move away, instead, she leaned into the embrace, fitting against me as though this was where she was meant to be. The faint scent of lavender clung to her, mixed with the warmth of tea still lingering in the air. I closed my eyes for a moment, simply letting myself feel the quiet steadiness of her beside me. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. Just a simple, unspoken understanding, that whatever had begun between us was real, and that it would grow in its own time. It wasn't about rushing forward, but about allowing the closeness to deepen, step by step, moment by moment. When I finally opened my eyes, the clock on the wall ticked softly, but neither of us moved. Her lips had left their warmth on my cheek, and her head remained resting on my shoulder. And in that quiet, I knew, this was enough. More than enough. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow burn romances. Your support helps me keep bringing these heartfelt stories to life.